What I would like to do tonight is to sort of finish something that I left with you last year, and of course I know when I say with you, it's not all of you, some of you, I see familiar faces. So some of this will be like a kind of spiral and French polishing, and there'll be thematic material that might repeat, but I hope not exactly in the same way. It'll be sort of like Bach using themes sometimes for, piano and harpsichord, and sometimes for organ, and then sometimes trying to make it for concerto grossi, and always playing around with the themes in a different context. What I'm involved in now is a kind of vast 6 or 7 year project on the evolution of consciousness, where it's kind of like mind jazz on ancient texts. I'm trying to go from the hominization of the primates to the planetization of humanity and the future of consciousness and the sort of crossing of technology and mysticism and its implications for who we are, where we're going, and what it's all about. So it's kind of like an old man summing up of 30 more years of cultural history and working with literature and being a poet and a novelist as well as a cultural historian. So it's an attempt to think the largest possible series of thoughts that I can, and so it takes a lot of time, and sometimes when I've done something and I realize I have to go back and rethink it all over again and discuss it again. Last time I kept talking about, I wish I had brought this video from my friend's lab, Lynn Margulis, and so this time I've brought it. So I want to use it and give you the visual imagery that are in my head. So what I'm going to do with these 5 talks is basically, tonight I'm going to talk about the evolution of consciousness and start with the spirochete to the spinal cord. And if I can get into the glacial cultural ecology, I will. If I feel I'm running out of time and we need more time for conversation, then I'll compress into the next lecture, next time, the glacial and riverine cultural ecologies. And then give you basically the architecture of this kind of theory of cultural transformation that I've been working with, that basically the deep structures of human culture are embedded in ecologies, and these cultural ecologies are characterized by mentalities that are deeply historical rooted, and the mentalities are such that they are simultaneously mathematical and literary. And so I'm constantly interested in the concert between science and art and religion, and a kind of triple description, a moire of spirituality, science, and art. And when the 3 overlap, then a moire pattern emerges and something else prophetically emerges like a standing wave in a river. And I think that something else is the culture we're trying to imagine ourselves into and reincarnate ourselves into. Some of it is technological excarnation and frightening. Some of it, I think, is imaginatively exciting. So I'll have a lot to say about that toward the end. I think something quite radical is happening. Just this week in the Science Times in New York, there was an article about AIDS is not now thought to be an HIV virus infection, but actually a DNA disease. And as a cultural historian, I'm very much interested in the relationship between disease and our narratives of disease, and how they begin to be descriptions of massive cultural transformations and changes. So if you go back, say, to Ludwig Fleck's important book that inspired Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Fleck's book was called The Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, and it was all about the origins of the narratives about syphilis and the role of syphilis in the West. Now, syphilis is a disease that emerges as part of the cultural collision of Europe and the New World. It's very similar to the kind of airborne viruses that are coming from rapid deforestation and alteration of the biosphere. So it's one of these very interesting cases to study how Europe and America collide, and there is this massive plague phenomena, and then the narratives that people use to describe the phenomenon are various forms of reinvention of self and culture. So it's first seen as the French pox, and is sinful, and is considered evil, and then slowly, as it changes through the phenomenology of the Wassermann test and the rise of Pasteur and bacteriology, the whole concept of syphilis begins to transform both our sense of medical practices and our sense of the nature of symbiotic co-symbionts of living with these little critters. If AIDS is a DNA disease, then it's beginning to be something that I talked about a generation ago in Darkness and Scattered Light, where I said if we're shifting from evolution by natural selection to evolution by cultural intrusion with genetic engineering, we will see, as we move into evolutionary management, we will see evolutionary pollution. So we may be in one of these interesting situations where our emergence into a new kind of cultural cyberspace with a densely saturated electromagnetic invisible environment that has feedback upon the self-naming autonomous systems of the immune system, and at the same time the feedback of the industrialization on the biosphere deforesting the planet and kicking out airborne viruses into from Africa into Europe, that we may be at one of these situations where we're now beginning to see evolutionary pollution, and disease is actually a form of evolutionary conversation with the species. And it is a form of conversation that cannot be perceived in the individual lifetime. It's actually occurring not in the crisp 32 frames per second that the ego might want, it's occurring at species time. And so it takes larger mythopoeic narratives to construct it to perceive it, because it's a macro event. When you see time in macro events, you're beginning to think mythically. Micro thinking is very specialized in expertise, and micro thinking makes these larger things invisible. So sometimes the first catching of these macro events and rendering them into discourse and narrative is through paranoid narratives, conspiracy theories, hysterical fundamentalisms, visions of terror and fear, sense of the presence of evil. Science fiction films sometimes catch up very quickly on very interesting transitions and register what we can't see we can dread, and render it into an experience. So science fiction, paranoia, hysteria, all of these are forms of imagining the invisible, and so they begin to be really very important for both the cultural historian or the artist or the person like myself who tries to be both at the same time. So I'm very much interested in how this quality of disease is interacting with technology, and my basic gut feeling is the new technologies that I discussed in the American Replacement of Nature are actually going to be very toxic, and that virtual reality helmets are going to be like the X-ray machines that I twinkled my toes in when I was a kid to see if my Tom McCann shoes fit. And then they learned that gives you cancer, and they took them out of the shoe stores. So I think we're going to have a generation of teenagers in shopping malls and video displays and virtual reality helmets are going to have Alzheimer's at 28, the way heavy metal musicians are deaf at 30. So, but all of that is, alas, teaching us something about the biology of incarnation and the new interface of the intimacy with our machines. And so technology and paranoid discourse and science fiction and the visions of the mother, Mira Richard, in Oroville, with her whole vision of the cells and the future of the evolution of humanity is at the cellular level. This was her obsession of trying to deal with the phenomenon of death in the cells. And of course, diseases of the immune system and autoimmune diseases are all coming down to this quality of self-naming, of self and other, and coming down to the cellular interface of this kind of noetic plasma we call a self that floats through the thymus and the blood, and the liquid and the fixed and the crystal in the human being as like a miniature continent. So I see in the sort of mystical visions of Mira Richard, Mira Alfasa, whatever you want to call her, the mother as she's called in the Aurobindo ashram, and I knew her and met her. I see in her visions also material that I want to somehow use as mappings for the future of consciousness. So all of these I'm going to try to explore in these 5 lectures, and then come back in January and concentrate on just the future part and deal with the new biospheric mentality and possible futures of consciousness. Today I want to go back to the other edge and deal with the evolution of consciousness, and start out with the most very primitive, simple form of life, the spirochete. Now, what happened since the last time I talked to you is we had a gathering of the Lindisfarne Fellows. There are about 52 Lindisfarne Fellows. Some of them are people you know, like Gary Snyder, and people like Gregory Bateson was a Lindisfarne Fellow, and E.F. Schumacher. And so we were basically, in my generation, the whole 70s alternative movement thing coming after the wave of the 60s. Michael Murphy, the founder of Esalen, is a Lindisfarne Fellow. So we're not an institution. We're a noetic plasma. We're an intellectual chamber music ensemble. I'm sort of the kind of musical director, and we get together, and we're spread all over the place, from here at CIIS to the cathedral, to Varela in Paris, to Jim Lovelock of the Gaia Hypothesis in England, and Stuart Kaufman at the Santa Fe Institute for the Study of the Sciences of Complexity. So we get together and we sort of think out loud and have a kind of mind jazz sessions where each of us will take the morning and go on a riff and explore whatever it is we're doing. And then when we all get together, we find there's a kind of common moire, or a sensibility that holds us together, a sort of shared vision and shared sense of excitement. So after exploring with you last January, I went and we got together, Varela from Paris and Stuart Kaufman from Santa Fe, and explored a lot of these themes about the evolution of consciousness. And so I think I see a little more now than I did last time. So I want to go back and deal with it. Now, the title of this video is Study the Monochord, which is the reputed dying words of Pythagoras. And Lynn Margulis is one of these Lindisfarne Fellows. Freeman Dyson calls her one of biology's immortals. She's a distinguished university professor at UMass Amherst. And she sort of reintroduced the whole theory of symbiosis and cell evolution, which was very heretical when she first brought it up in the late 70s and early 80s, but now is the accepted theory. I took about 2 hours of her footage from her lab and compressed it to 4 minutes of, for the MTV world, a 4-minute music video. The musical sounds you're seeing is from you're hearing is from one of the composers of the Lindisfarne Symposium in New York at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, named Raphael Mostel, the Tibetan singing bowls. He's kind of pissed off at me because I've taken little sounds from about 2 of his CDs and stitched them together to wed the sound to the image, because I was more interested in the image than the integrity of his music. So this is not classical music. I'm trying to use his music as a way of making the familiar theme hauntingly extraterrestrial and wild and weird. So when I saw this footage for the first time at a Lindisfarne gathering in Italy, in Perugia, when I saw this little spirochete, the most primitive form of life, that's just a rod without a head, just go boing like a string, the dying words of Pythagoras went boing in my head of study the monochord, and the spirochete looked to me like a plucked guitar string. And then flashed, because I tend to think visually, what flashed was, and I'll pass this out among you, was the picture of Pythagoras at the portal of the royal portal of the entrance to the Cathedral of Chartres. And he's hunched over the monochord. It looks as if it's Pythagoras inventing the laptop computer, but it's actually Pythagoras in the monochord. Let me have it back, because I had to go all the way to Paris and Chartres to get that, so I don't want another trip. Also brought this back for you from Paris. Okay, can we play the video? Thanks, Brian. You'll see spirochetes and protists, spirochetes attached to big, sluggish protists. Okay, so we start with the evolution of consciousness with as simple a form as we can get. Just a simple string of the spirochete, no head, no tail, and it goes bong. So the very first discrimination, as it goes boing and moves back and forth indiscriminately, is it creates this wave pattern, and now there is a lateral discrimination between one end versus the other, that if it goes in this direction and finds food and gets caught, then the other half is still going to keep wildly flagellating and beating, so that there's a kind of lateral discrimination even though it doesn't have a head. So you have a kind of behavior here that creates a form. What the form is that if one half is inhibited, it bounces off in the extracellular matrix off something else, and it stops for a moment, or it's chemically inhibited with a GABA inhibitor or whatever. If it stops this side, the other side is still wildly flagellating. It's going to have a new emergent property of directional motion. And as that directional motion impels it, and it finds food, then its sensitivity at this end, this quality of either being inhibited or having a physical wave come back on it, is going to have the quality of agitating and sensitizing this tip. And so its interaction with its own membrane and the extracellular matrix and the membrane of something else and its extracellular matrix is it causes a form of getting stuck. And so all of these things are looking for food. This thing may be looking to eat it, but somehow or other they have a sort of Cold War standoff, and out of that a new emergent property comes forth where it begins to be attached and wildly flagellating. I mean, this is all mindless agents. We're not talking about conscious purpose here. Wildly flagellating and beating up against one another we get a new emergent property where we get wave synchronization, and we begin to get